The village of Nkemdi was quiet, wrapped in the golden glow of the setting sun. Smoke curled from the thatched roofs of huts as women prepared the evening meal, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the dusty paths. But beneath the peace, a shadow loomed. Obinna, the village's finest hunter, stood before the shrine of Ani, the goddess of the land. He knelt, pressing his forehead to the cold earth, his heart pounding in his chest. Tonight, he would take an oath, one that would bind his fate forever. An old priest, his skin wrinkled like dry bark, stood beside him. He held a carved staff and spoke in a voice that seemed to echo through the trees. Obinna, son of Ifini, the priest intoned, "Do you swear before Ani, before the spirits of your ancestors, and before this village to honor your betrothal to Ifunanya, daughter of Uche?" Obinna swallowed. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept his gaze steady. "I swear." A gust of wind swept through the shrine, rustling the leaves of the sacred Iroko tree. It was as if the gods themselves had heard him. The priest dipped his fingers into a clay bowl filled with red oil and marked Obinna's forehead. "Then let this be your bond. If you ever break this vow, may the gods turn their backs on you." The weight of those words settled on Obinna's shoulders, but he did not flinch. Ifunanya was beautiful, kind, and strong, the perfect wife. He had no reason to betray his vow. Or so he thought. As he left the shrine, his hunting spear slung over his back, his heart was light. The next full moon would bring his wedding, and he would finally call Ifunanya his wife. But fate, like a cunning hunter, had set a trap he could not see. And soon, the oath he swore would become his greatest burden. The days passed swiftly, and the village of Nkemdi buzzed with preparations for Obinna and Ifunanya's wedding. Women wove new clothes from the finest cotton, the men brewed palm wine, and the elders spoke of the union as a blessing to the land. But in the heart of the forest, where the hunters set their traps and whispered secrets to the wind, another story was beginning to unfold. Obinna had gone deep into the woods that morning, his bow and arrows strapped across his back. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the sounds of birds filled the trees. He had been tracking an antelope for hours when he saw her. A woman. She stood by the river, her feet barely touching the ground, her long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall. She was not from Nkemdi. Her beauty was unfamiliar, unsettling, almost otherworldly. Obinna should have turned away. He should have ignored the way her skin glowed in the sunlight, the way her eyes, dark as the night, seemed to pull him closer. But he did not. Instead, he stepped forward. The woman turned, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "You are Obinna," she said, her voice as smooth as the flowing river. His grip on his bow tightened. "Who are you?" She tilted her head. "A traveler." He frowned. No one traveled through the forest alone, especially not a woman. "Where do you come from?" She took a step closer. "Does it matter?" Something in her tone sent a shiver down his spine, but he did not move. "My name is Adaku," she continued. "And I have been waiting for you." Obinna's breath caught. "Waiting for me?" Adaku nodded. "The gods send signs, don't they? Perhaps I am one." His mind screamed at him to walk away, to remember the oath he had taken. But his heart pounded, his blood ran hot, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Because in that moment, under the canopy of ancient trees, he knew one truth. He wanted her. And in that desire, his betrayal had already begun. Obinna knew he should leave. His people had warned him about strange women in the forest, spirits who took the form of mortals, seducing men into ruin. But Adaku stood before him, flesh and blood, her gaze locked onto his as if she could see into the deepest corners of his soul. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice strained. Adaku stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "What do you want, Obinna?" His heart pounded. He thought of Ifunanya, her warm smile, her gentle laughter. He thought of the oath he had taken, the promise sealed with the gods as witnesses. But at that moment, under the watchful eyes of the trees, Ifunanya felt like a distant memory. Adaku reached out, her fingers grazing his arm. A strange warmth spread through him, like fire licking at dry wood. His breath hitched. "You are betrothed," she murmured. "And yet, you stand before me." Obinna swallowed hard. She placed a finger on his lips. "Do not lie to yourself." The air between them crackled with something dangerous. He had hunted wild beasts all his life, had faced the sharp horns of a charging buffalo, but never had he felt so helpless. "Meet me here tomorrow," Adaku whispered. "At dusk." Before he could respond, she turned and walked toward the river. The wind carried her scent, sweet, intoxicating. Obinna watched as she disappeared into the mist. He stood there for a long time, his thoughts warring with his desires. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and made his way back to the village. But even as he walked toward home, he knew the truth. He would return. The village of Nkemdi was alive with the sounds of evening, women pounding yam, children laughing, and the rhythmic beats of drums in the distance. But Obinna barely heard any of it. His mind was in the forest, with Adaku. As he walked toward his hut, he saw Ifunanya waiting for him. She smiled, the glow of the evening fire reflecting in her warm eyes. "You are late," she said softly, reaching for his hand. Obinna hesitated before taking it. Her touch was familiar, comforting, but it did not send fire through his veins like Adaku's. "I was hunting," he said quickly, forcing a smile. The antelope was difficult to track. Ifunanya nodded, unaware of the lie hidden in his words. "Come, my love. My mother has prepared a feast in your honor." She led him toward the gathering, where villagers welcomed him with laughter and palm wine. But as he sat among them, drinking and eating, he felt like a stranger. For the first time in his life, he was keeping a secret. And as the night stretched on, the weight of it grew heavier. When the moon rose high in the sky, Obinna excused himself. His feet carried him toward his hut, but his heart was already in the forest. Tomorrow, at dusk, he would return to Adaku. And with that decision, the path of betrayal was set. The next evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Obinna left the village, his heart racing. He told himself he was only going to see Adaku one last time, to satisfy his curiosity and then walk away. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. The forest was quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves. The river shimmered in the fading light, and there, standing by the water, was Adaku. She turned as he approached, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "You came." Obinna swallowed hard. "I should not be here." Adaku took a step closer, her eyes holding his. "Yet, here you are." He felt trapped between duty and desire, between the life he had built and the temptation standing before him. She reached for his hand, her touch burning through him like wildfire. "Tell me, Obinna," she whispered. "Do you love Ifunanya?" His breath caught. It should have been an easy answer. Yes. Yes, he loved Ifunanya. She was his future, the woman he had sworn to marry. But in that moment, standing under the watchful eyes of the trees, he hesitated. Adaku's fingers traced his jawline. "If you have to think about it, then you already know the truth." Obinna clenched his fists, trying to resist the pull of her words. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice rough. She smiled, tilting her head. "Only what you want to give." Then, before he could stop himself, before reason could drag him back to the safety of his village, Obinna closed the distance between them. And when their lips met, the gods turned their faces away. The kiss lingered, setting Obinna's blood on fire. It was unlike anything he had ever known, dangerous, forbidden, intoxicating. When he finally pulled away, breathless, Adaku's eyes held a quiet triumph. "You have chosen, Obinna," she murmured. Reality came crashing down on him. His chest tightened. "No," he whispered, stepping back. "This was a mistake." Adaku arched a brow. "A mistake? Yet, you came willingly." Obinna clenched his fists. He had broken his vow, betrayed Ifunanya, and disrespected the gods. The weight of his actions settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "I must go," he said, his voice strained. Adaku's smile didn't waver. "You will return." Obinna turned sharply and walked away, his heart pounding with each step. But her words echoed in his mind. Because deep down, he feared she was right. By the time he reached the village, the moon was high, casting long shadows over the huts. Obinna moved quickly, hoping to slip into his hut unnoticed, but fate had other plans. Ifunanya has been waiting for you." He froze. The voice belonged to her father, Uche, one of the respected elders of Nkemdi. Obinna turned slowly, forcing a smile. "I was in the forest, tracking a wounded animal." Uche's sharp eyes studied him. "At this hour?" Obinna swallowed. He had never lied to Ifunanya's family before, but now the lies were piling up like dry leaves before a storm. Before Uche could question him further, Ifunanya appeared, relief flooding her face. "You're back," she said softly, stepping forward to take his hand. "I was worried." Guilt twisted in Obinna's stomach. Her hands were warm, familiar, safe, so unlike the fire Adaku ignited in him. He forced a smile. "I am here now." Ifunanya's eyes searched his, but she said nothing. Yet, deep inside, Obinna knew, this was only the beginning. And soon, the gods would demand a price for his betrayal. Days passed, but Obinna was no longer the same. He went about his duties, hunting, preparing for the wedding, smiling when expected, but his mind was always in the forest, where Adaku's touch still burned on his skin. Ifunanya noticed the change. "You have been distant," she said one evening as they sat outside her father's hut, watching the fire crackle. "Have I done something wrong?" Obinna forced a smile. "Of course not. The wedding preparations have simply taken much of my strength." She studied him, doubt flickering in her eyes. "You are sure?" A lump formed in his throat, but he nodded. "I am sure." She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "I cannot wait to be your wife, Obinna." His heart clenched. He should have felt joy, but all he felt was shame. That night, as the village slept, he made a decision. He would not return to Adaku. He would honor his vow, marry Ifunanya, and put his betrayal behind him. But fate had other plans. The next afternoon, as Obinna walked toward the river to fetch water, a soft voice called his name. He stopped. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned, and there she was. Adaku. She stood beneath a tall palm tree, the wind playing with her hair. Her eyes held something dark, unreadable. "You did not come," she said simply. Obinna's fists clenched. "I cannot see you anymore, Adaku. It was a mistake." She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Was it?" He swallowed. "I am to be married soon. I will not betray Ifunanya again." Adaku stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You already have, Obinna. Do you think the gods have not seen?" A chill ran down his spine. She took another step closer. "The gods do not forgive so easily." Obinna's mouth went dry. "What are you saying?" Adaku tilted her head. "You will know soon enough." Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Obinna stood frozen, a cold fear creeping into his heart. For the first time, he realized, his betrayal would not remain a secret. And the gods were watching. For days, he tried to focus on his wedding preparations, but an uneasy feeling settled over him like a thick fog. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her smile, heard her whisper, "The gods do not forgive so easily." Then the signs began. The first was the wounded goat. One morning, as the village gathered in the marketplace, a young boy came running, breathless and wide-eyed. "Obinna, your goat, it is dying." Obinna rushed to his compound and found his strongest goat, one he had planned to offer as a wedding sacrifice, lying on the ground, bleeding from its throat. No predator had attacked it, and no blade had touched it. It was as if an invisible force had struck the life from its body. The elders muttered among themselves, their faces grim. "A bad omen," one whispered. Obinna said nothing, but deep inside, dread took root. Ifunanya had been gifted a mirror from a traveling merchant, a rare treasure in the village. The night before their traditional wedding rites, she invited Obinna to see it. She held it up, smiling. "Look, my love. It is beautiful, isn't it?" Obinna forced himself to nod. But as he stepped forward, the mirror cracked, a jagged line running from top to bottom. Ifunanya gasped. "Obinna, what does this mean?" His mouth went dry. It's nothing," he lied. But he knew it was not nothing. The gods were watching. And they were warning him. The third sign came on the eve of the wedding. Obinna had barely slept, The air was thick with tension, and his body felt restless. He decided to walk to the river, hoping the cool air would clear his mind. But when he reached the water's edge, his blood turned to ice. There, floating in the river, was a piece of white cloth, soaked in blood. It was the same cloth Ifunanya had worn the previous day. Obinna staggered backward, his chest heaving. And then, from the shadows of the trees, a voice whispered, "You cannot escape your sins, Obinna." He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Yet, deep in his bones, he knew. Adaku had returned. And the gods were coming for him. Obinna's heart pounded as he walked back to the village, his thoughts tangled like a hunter's net. The image of the cloth floating in the river haunted him. Was it a warning? A sign of danger? He needed answers. As he neared Ifunanya's hut, he hesitated. Could he tell her about the strange events? About the uneasy feeling creeping into his soul? He pushed aside the woven curtain and stepped inside. Ifunanya sat on a low stool, brushing her hair, the glow of the evening fire casting soft shadows on her face. She turned and smiled. "Obinna, you look troubled." He opened his mouth, then closed it. What would he say? That he had seen something he didn't understand? That his heart was heavy with guilt? He forced a small smile. "It's nothing. Just the weight of the wedding preparations." She set her comb down and took his hand. "You do not have to carry everything alone." Her words were gentle, but Obinna felt the weight of his silence growing heavier. The next morning, just as the village prepared for the final wedding rites, an urgent call spread through the air. The chief priest had summoned Obinna to the shrine. Elders whispered as he made his way there. Some watched him with quiet curiosity, others with concern. The shrine stood beneath a great iroko tree, where the chief priest sat before a sacred fire. His eyes, sharp with wisdom, studied Obinna carefully. "Do you know why you have been called?" the priest asked. Obinna shook his head, though unease twisted in his stomach. The priest sighed deeply. "The spirits are restless. There is a burden upon you, and the gods have taken notice." A hush settled over the gathering. The words were clear, something was amiss. Obinna swallowed. "What must I do?" The priest's gaze did not waver. The truth must always find its way to light. If a man carries a heavy secret, he must decide, will he confess, or will he allow the spirits to decide his fate? Obinna's chest tightened. The weight of his choices loomed over him like a storm cloud. That evening, as villagers gathered for the wedding celebration, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. A strong wind swept through the village, shaking the trees and stirring the fires. Then, as quickly as it came, the wind stilled. The night air grew eerily quiet. A voice, barely above a whisper, seemed to drift through the air. "You cannot hide from fate, Obinna." His breath caught in his throat. He turned sharply, searching the shadows. But there was no one there. Only the feeling that something unseen was watching, waiting. Obinna barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the priest's words echoed in his mind. The truth must always find its way to light. By dawn, the village was alive with preparations for the final wedding rites. Drums echoed through the air, women sang as they wove fresh decorations, and elders gathered at the shrine to bless the union. Yet, amidst the celebration, Obinna felt the weight of a shadow he could not escape. Just before the ceremony began, the chief priest called for Obinna again. This time, the old man's gaze was more serious than before. He gestured for Obinna to sit before the sacred fire. "The spirits have spoken," the priest said. "They say you stand at a crossroads." Obinna felt a cold shiver run through him. "What do they want from me?" The priest picked up a handful of white chalk and drew a single line on the ground. "If a man walks this path with a clean heart, the gods bless him. But if his heart is heavy with secrets, the earth beneath his feet will shake." Obinna clenched his fists. "I have done nothing to offend the gods." The priest's sharp eyes studied him. "Are you certain?" Obinna could not answer. As the sun climbed higher, the village gathered for the wedding feast. Obinna stood beside Ifunanya, forcing a smile as the elders blessed their union. She looked radiant in her ceremonial attire, her eyes filled with joy and trust. Then, Just as the final blessing was spoken, something unexpected happened. A young girl, carrying a calabash of palm wine meant for the couple, tripped on the ground, and the calabash slipped from her hands. It shattered. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. One of the elders gasped. "This is a bad sign." Ifunanya's mother rushed forward, her voice tight with concern. "The gods reject broken offerings." Obinna's heart pounded. He turned to the priest, who stood still, watching him carefully. "The earth beneath your feet is shifting, Obinna," the priest said in a low voice. "You must set things right before it is too late." Obinna swallowed hard. The gods were speaking. And time was running out. The shattered calabash lay in pieces at Obinna's feet, the silence stretching unbearably. He could feel the weight of every eye upon him, Ifunanya's, the elders, the priests. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He knew then that he could not escape. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Ifunanya. Her eyes, once full of joy, now held confusion. He reached for her hand, but she pulled back. "Ifunanya," he said, his voice unsteady. "There is something I must tell you." The elders murmured, sensing the moment's gravity. The priest nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for this. Obinna's heart pounded. He took another breath, steadying himself. "I have not been honest. Before our wedding, I made a mistake." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ifunanya's hands trembled. "What mistake?" she whispered. Obinna looked down, shame burning through him. "I was with another. And now, the gods are displeased." Silence. Then, a whisper of disbelief. Ifunanya's mother clutched her chest. "Obinna, what have you done?" The chief priest stepped forward. "The spirits do not seek to punish without reason. They have given you a chance to confess, and now they will decide." A sudden wind blew through the gathering, rustling the leaves. A deep rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Then, just as quickly, the air grew still. The priest closed his eyes, as if listening to something unseen. When he opened them, his gaze softened. "The gods have heard your truth, and they are satisfied." Obinna exhaled, his shoulders sagging. But Ifunanya's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She stepped back, shaking her head. "You have broken my trust, Obinna." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I will spend my life making it right, if you let me." The elders watched in silence. Then, after what felt like eternity, Ifunanya straightened her shoulders. "A marriage cannot be built on deception," she said firmly. "But neither can I ignore the gods' mercy." She turned to the priest. "The decision must be mine." The priest nodded. "And what do you choose?" A tear slipped down her cheek. She looked at Obinna, the man she had loved and trusted, the man who had broken her heart yet stood before her, owning his faults. "I choose to walk away." A hushed gasp spread through the crowd, but Ifunanya lifted her chin. "I will not marry a man whose heart was not fully mine." Obinna closed his eyes, pain slicing through him. But when he opened them, he saw something in Ifunanya's gaze, not hatred, not bitterness, but strength. And he understood. The gods had not just demanded the truth. They had demanded justice. And Ifunanya had delivered it. As she turned and walked away, the sky above remained clear, the wind gentle, the earth steady beneath their feet. The gods were watching. And they were satisfied. The end.